The last person I expected to see that morning stepped out of a black luxury sedan and walked straight toward the front gate of the Whitmore estate. My name is Rachel Parker, and 3 years earlier, I had left that same property carrying 2 suitcases, a broken marriage, and a humiliation I thought I would never forget. Yet there I was again, standing before the iron gates that had once closed behind me for what everyone believed was the final time. The estate looked exactly as I remembered. The long tree-lined driveway stretched across the property. The stone fountain still stood proudly in the center circle. The mansion itself rose behind it all, elegant and imposing beneath the bright Connecticut sky. 3 years had passed, but somehow the place seemed frozen in time. I sat quietly in the back seat for a moment before stepping out. The driver asked if I needed anything else. I thanked him and said no. As the car pulled away, I found myself staring at the house where so many chapters of my life had begun and ended. A breeze moved through the trees. Somewhere in the distance, a lawn-mower hummed. Everything felt strangely ordinary. That was the part that surprised me most. I expected anger. I expected bitterness. Instead, I felt calm. 3 years earlier, calm would have been impossible. Back then, I had stood at these same gates in the rain. My clothes were soaked. My eyes burned from crying. My mother-in-law, Evelyn Whitmore, had made it clear that I no longer belonged. The details of that day still lived somewhere inside me, but time had changed the way they felt. Some wounds stop hurting. They become lessons instead. The security guard approached cautiously. At first, he did not recognize me. Why would he? 3 years can change a person. My hair was shorter now. My posture was different. Even the way I carried myself had changed. Life has a way of rebuilding you when it gives you no other choice. "Can I help you?" he asked politely. I smiled. "I believe they are expecting me." His expression shifted as recognition slowly appeared. Before he could answer, another vehicle turned into the driveway. A silver sedan approached and stopped near the gate. The driver stepped out. It was Michael. My former husband looked older than I remembered. Not dramatically older. Just tired. The kind of tiredness that comes from carrying responsibilities for too long. For a moment, neither of us spoke. We simply looked at each other. 3 years of silence stood between us. "Rachel," he finally said. I nodded. "Hello, Michael." He glanced toward the mansion before looking back at me. "Thank you for coming." It was such a simple sentence. Yet hearing it after everything that had happened felt almost surreal. I studied his face, searching for resentment, guilt, anger, or regret. Instead, I saw something else. Relief. As though my arrival had solved a problem he could no longer handle alone. That realization raised even more questions. Why had they invited me back after all this time? Why now? And why did Michael look so worried? We began walking toward the house together. Neither of us rushed to fill the silence. The gravel crunched beneath our shoes. The fountain splashed quietly in the distance. Every step carried memories. Family dinners. Holiday celebrations. Arguments. Laughter. Dreams that had once felt permanent. As we approached the front entrance, I noticed several expensive vehicles parked outside. More than usual. Something important was happening inside. Michael seemed nervous. He kept adjusting his watch and checking his phone. "Is everyone here?" I asked. He nodded. "Yes." "Including your mother?" Another pause. "Especially my mother." I looked up at the massive front doors. 3 years ago, I had walked away from this place believing I would never return. Yet life rarely follows the path we imagine. Sometimes the door that closes behind you eventually opens again. The difference is that by the time it does, you are no longer the same person who left. And as Michael reached for the handle, I realized something important. I had not returned to reclaim the past. I had returned because the future of the Whitmore family depended on a truth that nobody inside that house was prepared to face. The moment I stepped inside the mansion, the memories came rushing back. The polished marble floors looked exactly the same. The grand staircase curved elegantly toward the second floor. Crystal chandeliers reflected warm light across the foyer. 3 years earlier, I had walked out carrying everything I owned in 2 suitcases. Now I was back, not as a member of the family, not as a wife, and certainly not as the frightened woman who had left. Michael guided me toward the library where everyone was waiting. As we walked, I noticed subtle signs that things were not as perfect as they appeared. A decorative table near the hallway had been removed. Several paintings I remembered were gone. Small details, perhaps, but in a house like this, details mattered. Wealth rarely disappears overnight. It leaves clues first. Michael seemed eager to speak but struggled to find the words. Finally, he said, "There are things you do not know." I almost laughed. "There are many things I do not know, Michael." His expression tightened. "You are right." Before he could continue, we reached the library doors. Through the glass panels, I could see several family members gathered around a large conference table. The atmosphere felt more like a business meeting than a family gathering. The moment I entered, conversation stopped. Every pair of eyes turned toward me. Some looked surprised. Others looked uncomfortable. A few appeared relieved. Then I saw Evelyn Whitmore sitting at the far end of the table. Time had changed her as well. Her silver hair was styled perfectly as always. Her posture remained straight and controlled. Yet something about her seemed different. Smaller somehow. Not physically. Emotionally. The confidence I remembered was still there, but it no longer filled the room the way it once had. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. 3 years ago, she had delivered the final words that ended my marriage and my place in this family. Now we sat facing one another again. "Rachel," she finally said. Her voice remained calm. "Thank you for coming." I nodded politely. "You said it was important." A strange silence followed. I expected hostility. I expected coldness. Instead, everyone seemed nervous. That realization unsettled me more than anger would have. Evelyn gestured toward an empty chair. "Please sit." I took the seat without argument. A thick folder rested in front of every person at the table. Financial reports. Legal documents. Charts. Numbers. Whatever crisis had brought me back clearly involved more than family emotions. One of the executives cleared his throat and began speaking. Within minutes, a picture started forming. The Whitmore family company was struggling. Several major investments had failed. Revenue had declined for consecutive years. Loans were coming due. Partners were growing concerned. As the presentation continued, I noticed something fascinating. Nobody looked surprised. They already knew. They had been living with this reality for months. Perhaps longer. The executive finished speaking and left the room. Another silence settled over the table. Finally, Evelyn folded her hands. "You are probably wondering why you are here." That thought crossed my mind. For the first time, I saw something unexpected in her eyes. Not arrogance. Not judgment. Regret. It appeared only briefly before disappearing again. 3 years ago, she said carefully, "I believed I was protecting my family." The words landed heavily between us. I remembered every detail of that day. The accusations. The humiliation. The certainty with which she had decided I did not belong. Yet I remained silent. There would be time for old wounds later. Evelyn continued. "Today I am no longer certain about many things." The room grew still. Family members exchanged uneasy glances. Michael looked down at the table. Whatever was happening, it was bigger than a financial crisis. Much bigger. Then Evelyn opened a drawer beside her chair and removed a sealed envelope. The paper looked old. Years old. She stared at it for several moments before placing it on the table. "There is something your father-in-law left behind," she said quietly. "Something I should have shown everyone a long time ago." As I looked at the envelope, a strange feeling settled over me. Somehow I knew that whatever was inside had the power to change everything we thought we knew about the past. No one moved as Evelyn slowly opened the envelope. The sound of the paper seemed unusually loud inside the silent library. Every person at the table watched her hands. Even the executives sitting near the windows appeared tense. Whatever was inside that envelope had been hidden for years, and judging by the expressions around me, I was not the only one who sensed its importance. Evelyn carefully unfolded the letter. For a moment, she simply stared at the page. The confident woman I once knew seemed to disappear. In her place sat someone carrying the weight of a decision she regretted. Finally, she began reading. The letter had been written by my late father-in-law, Charles Whitmore, only a few months before his death. His words were calm and direct, exactly as I remembered him. Charles had always possessed a rare ability to speak honestly without raising his voice. As Evelyn read, memories returned. Charles had been the first person in the family to welcome me without conditions. While others measured success through money, status, or influence, he measured people by character. He listened. He observed. Most importantly, he never rushed to judge. The letter continued. Charles described concerns about the future of the family business. He warned that difficult years might eventually come. Several people at the table shifted uncomfortably. The prediction had proven accurate. Then the tone of the letter changed. Charles began writing about trust. About leadership. About integrity. He wrote that companies survive challenges when good people remain united. He wrote that pride often creates problems that wisdom could prevent. I noticed Michael staring at the table. Evelyn's voice grew softer with each paragraph. Then came the part that changed the atmosphere in the room completely. Charles mentioned me by name. My heart nearly stopped. I had not expected that. Neither had anyone else. Evelyn paused before continuing. The silence stretched for several seconds. Finally, she forced herself to read the next lines aloud. Charles wrote that during his illness, he had spent countless hours watching the people around him. He had seen who stayed when situations became difficult. He had seen who helped without being asked. He had seen who cared more about people than appearances. Then he wrote something that left the entire room speechless. He described me as one of the strongest and most trustworthy people he had ever known. I felt heat rise to my face. Across the table, several relatives exchanged stunned glances. Evelyn continued reading. Charles explained that if anything happened to him, he hoped the family would never underestimate my judgment, my loyalty, or my ability to help guide important decisions. The room became completely still. I could almost hear people breathing. For years, I had carried the memory of being treated like an outsider. Yet here was proof that the man who built the Whitmore legacy had viewed me very differently. When Evelyn finally reached the end of the letter, she lowered the paper and stared down at it. Nobody spoke. Nobody seemed to know what to say. The letter did not accuse anyone. It did not assign blame. Yet somehow it revealed more than any argument ever could. After a long silence, Evelyn looked directly at me. Her eyes appeared older than I remembered. "I never showed anyone this," she admitted quietly. "Not Michael. Not the board. Not the family." The confession hung heavily in the air. Michael looked shocked. "Mother, why?" She closed her eyes briefly. "Because I convinced myself that Charles was wrong." The honesty of that answer surprised everyone. Including me. Evelyn took a slow breath. "I thought I understood what was best for this family. I thought I was protecting everything he built." Her voice trembled slightly. "Instead, I may have destroyed the very thing he valued most." Nobody interrupted her. Years of certainty seemed to be collapsing in front of us. Then Evelyn slid the letter across the table toward me. "There is more," she said. "Much more. And before this day ends, you deserve to know the truth about what really happened 3 years ago." For several moments, nobody spoke. The weight of Evelyn's confession settled over the room like a heavy fog. I looked down at the letter in front of me and ran my fingers across the paper. 3 years earlier, I would have given anything to hear those words. Back then, I wanted someone to believe me. I wanted someone to ask questions before making decisions. Instead, I had become the easiest person to blame. Now, sitting in the same library where so many important family conversations had taken place, I felt something unexpected. Not satisfaction. Not vindication. Just sadness. Evelyn slowly folded her hands on the table. "You deserve to know how everything happened," she said quietly. Michael shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Several family members exchanged nervous glances. Clearly, this was not a story many of them had heard before. Evelyn stared at the window for a moment before continuing. "After Charles passed away, I became terrified." The admission seemed difficult for her. "I spent my entire life believing that control could solve every problem. When he was gone, I convinced myself that protecting the family meant making every decision personally." She gave a bitter smile. Fear has a way of disguising itself as confidence. Nobody interrupted. She continued speaking. "The company was entering a difficult period. We had projects underperforming. Market conditions were changing. Investors were becoming impatient. Everywhere I looked, there were risks." Her eyes met mine. "And then there was you." I remained silent. "You were asking questions nobody else was asking. You challenged certain decisions. You pointed out problems that I did not want to acknowledge." I remembered those conversations. I had never tried to challenge her authority. I simply cared about the future of the family business because it affected everyone. Yet at the time, every disagreement had been interpreted as criticism. Evelyn looked down at the table. "I began viewing your concerns as threats instead of warnings." Michael rubbed his forehead. "Rachel was trying to help." Evelyn nodded slowly. "I know that now." The room fell quiet again. Then she revealed something that surprised everyone. Several years before I left, I had prepared an independent financial review of one of the company's largest expansion projects. The report identified significant risks and recommended caution. I remembered spending weeks researching the numbers. I remembered presenting the findings. And I remembered being ignored. Evelyn took a deep breath. The project moved forward anyway. Her voice grew softer. "It became one of the largest losses in company history." I looked around the room. Some relatives seemed shocked. Others looked as though they had suspected this for years. Suddenly, many pieces began fitting together. The failed investments. The missing artwork. The financial pressure. The struggling business. Evelyn continued. "When the losses became impossible to hide, I needed someone to blame." The honesty of her words stunned me. "Instead of admitting my own mistakes, I convinced myself that your influence had created division within the family." She paused. "That was easier than facing the truth." Michael looked away. I could see regret written across his face. Perhaps he was remembering the same arguments I was. The same painful conversations. The same silence when support mattered most. "I told myself I was protecting the Whitmore legacy," Evelyn said. "In reality, I was protecting my pride." No one moved. No one spoke. The room seemed frozen in time. Finally, Evelyn reached into another folder and removed several documents. She pushed them across the table toward me. "These are copies of your original reports," she said. "Every prediction you made came true." I stared at the pages. The dates were there. The recommendations. The warnings. Everything. Evidence that had existed long before the crisis. Evidence that should have mattered. As I turned the pages, a strange realization settled over me. The story was never about being accepted by a wealthy family. It was never about social status or inheritance. It was about truth. And for 3 years, the truth had remained buried beneath fear, pride, and silence. Then Evelyn looked directly at me and said something I never expected to hear. "Rachel, the reason we asked you to come back is not because we need forgiveness." She paused. "It is because we need your help." The request caught everyone by surprise, including me. For several seconds, I simply stared at Evelyn. After everything that had happened, after 3 years of silence, after being blamed for problems I had tried to prevent, the Whitmore family was asking for my help. The irony was impossible to ignore. I looked around the table. Nobody appeared amused. Nobody appeared confident. In fact, most of them looked worried. Truly worried. That told me more than any financial report ever could. The situation was serious. "What exactly do you need from me?" I asked. Evelyn exchanged a glance with Michael before answering. "An honest assessment." I almost smiled. 3 years earlier, honesty had been the one thing nobody wanted. Now it was apparently the most valuable thing in the room. Michael slid a folder toward me. "We prepared a summary of the current situation." I opened it slowly. The numbers were worse than I expected. Several divisions were underperforming. Debt obligations were increasing. Long-term contracts had failed to generate projected returns. More concerning than any individual problem was the pattern itself. The company had spent years reacting to symptoms instead of addressing causes. As I reviewed the documents, old memories returned. I remembered late nights sitting at the kitchen table with spreadsheets spread across every surface. I remembered trying to explain why certain expansion plans carried unnecessary risk. I remembered being told that I lacked experience. Looking at the numbers now felt like reading the final chapter of a book whose ending I had predicted years earlier. Yet I felt no satisfaction. Only disappointment. Businesses struggle. Markets change. Mistakes happen. None of that bothered me. What bothered me was how many of these problems could have been avoided through simple conversations and a willingness to listen. After nearly 20 minutes, I closed the folder. "You have operational issues," I said calmly. "But your biggest problem is leadership." The room immediately grew uncomfortable. Several executives shifted in their chairs. One relative looked away. Evelyn remained silent. "Leadership?" one board member asked. I nodded. For years, important decisions were made by too few people. Dissenting opinions were treated as obstacles instead of information. That creates blind spots. Nobody argued. That alone told me I was probably correct. In healthy organizations, people debate. In unhealthy ones, people become afraid to speak honestly. I continued reviewing documents while the others listened. Gradually, a strange thing began happening. The conversation stopped feeling like a confrontation. It started feeling like work. Real work. The kind I had always enjoyed. Solving problems. Identifying patterns. Building solutions. For the first time that day, I forgot about old arguments and focused entirely on the future. Several hours passed. Coffee cups were replaced. Additional reports arrived. Questions were asked. Answers were discussed. Somewhere along the way, the tension in the room began easing. Not because the problems disappeared, but because people finally started talking openly about them. Late in the afternoon, the meeting paused for a short break. I stepped outside onto the back terrace overlooking the gardens. The view remained beautiful. Manicured hedges stretched across the property. The fountain sparkled in the afternoon sunlight. Everything appeared peaceful from a distance. Footsteps approached behind me. I turned and found Michael standing there. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then he sighed. You were right. I looked away toward the gardens. About what? About more things than I want to admit. His voice carried genuine regret. I should have listened. The words were simple, but they carried years of meaning. I studied his face carefully. 3 years ago, I had wanted an apology. Back then, it would have changed everything. Now I was not so sure. Time changes priorities. Healing rarely comes from hearing the exact words you once needed. Sometimes it comes from becoming the person who no longer depends on them. Before I could respond, the terrace doors opened again. One of the executives stepped outside looking nervous. We found something, he said. Every conversation stopped. Even Michael seemed alarmed. What is it? The executive hesitated. It is another document from Charles Whitmore. And based on what it contains, the entire story may be bigger than any of us realized. The executive led us back into the library, and the atmosphere immediately changed. Whatever confidence had begun returning to the room disappeared. Everyone took their seats again. The document rested in the center of the table inside a worn leather folder that looked almost as old as the company itself. Evelyn stared at it as though she had seen a ghost. Michael looked equally unsettled. I remained silent, watching carefully. The executive opened the folder and slid several pages across the table. We discovered these in a secured archive during the document review, he explained. They were stored separately from the main company records. Evelyn slowly picked up the first page. Her expression changed almost immediately. I remember this, she whispered. The room fell silent. What is it? Michael asked. Evelyn took a deep breath before answering. It is part of Charles's long-term succession plan. That statement alone surprised everyone. As far as most people know, the succession plan had already been settled years ago. Yet the documents in front of us suggested otherwise. The executive continued. There are several revisions. The final version was never implemented. Evelyn carefully turned another page. Her hands were trembling slightly. For the first time in my life, I saw genuine uncertainty in her. The woman who once seemed capable of controlling every situation is now overwhelmed by the past. Then she reached a section that made her stop completely. No, she said softly. That cannot be right. Michael leaned forward. What does it say? She looked at him for several seconds before speaking. According to this version, your father intended to create an independent advisory board after his retirement. Several relatives exchanged confused looks. The company had never established such a board. Evelyn continued reading. The board was supposed to include experienced executives, outside consultants, and one family representative selected specifically for judgment and long-term planning ability. A strange feeling settled in my stomach. Something about the wording felt familiar. Then Evelyn lowered the page and looked directly at me. Nobody else moved. Nobody else even seemed to breathe. Rachel, she said quietly. The family representative was supposed to be you. The words echoed through the room. For several moments, nobody spoke. I honestly thought I had misunderstood. Me? The woman who had been dismissed as an outsider? The woman who had eventually been pushed out of the family entirely? It made no sense. Yet the document was sitting right there. Michael immediately reached for the pages and began reading for himself. The further he read, the paler he became. Finally he looked up. It is true. His voice sounded almost distant. Dad specifically named Rachel. A dozen memories flashed through my mind at once. Long conversation with Charles about business strategy. Discussions about market trends. Even casual dinners where he asked questions nobody else seemed interested in asking. At the time, I thought he was simply being kind. Now I realized he had been evaluating something much deeper. The executive continued explaining the documents. According to Charles's notes, He believed future success would depend on balancing financial performance with honest internal feedback. He worries that the company might eventually become trapped inside its own assumptions. He wanted people willing to challenge decides respectfully rather than simply agree with them. As the explanation continued, I noticed several board members nodding. Some appeared embarrassed. Others looked relieved. The truth was becoming impossible to ignore. Many of the problems facing the company today had originated from the exact risks Charles had warned about years earlier. Evelyn sat quietly throughout most of the discussion. Finally she spoke. "I destroyed this plan." Nobody responded. She looked down at the documents. "I convinced myself that I knew better. I removed every safeguard he wanted in place." Her voice cracked slightly. "And when Rachel raised concerns similar to his, I treated her as the problem instead of listening." The room remained silent. Not because anyone disagreed. Because there was nothing left to argue. The evidence speaks for itself. Then the executive revealed one final detail. "There is another reason these documents matter," he said. Charles included a contingency recommendation if the company ever entered a serious recovery period. Michael frowned. "What recommendation?" The executive looked directly at me. He recommended that Rachel Parker be consulted before any major restructuring decisions were approved. Once again, the room went completely still. And for the second time that day, I realized that Charles Whitmore had believed in me far more than I had ever known. For a long moment, nobody spoke after the executive finished. The silence felt different from the others that day. Earlier silences had been filled with tension, uncertainty, and regret. This one carried something else. Recognition. People were beginning to understand how many decisions had been shaped by assumptions instead of facts. I sat quietly, staring at the documents spread across the table. Part of me wanted to laugh at the absurdity of it all. 3 years ago, I had been treated as though I did not belong in the room. Now I was sitting at the center of a conversation that might determine the future of the entire company. Life has a strange sense of timing. Evelyn slowly removed her glasses and put them on the table. For the first time all day, she looked directly at the other board members rather than at the documents. "You all deserve an explanation," she said. Several people nodded. Others looked uneasy. When Charles passed away, I inherited more responsibility than I was prepared to carry. Instead of admitting that, I convinced myself I needed complete control. Her voice remained calm, but the emotions beneath it were impossible to miss. Anyone who questioned my decisions felt like a threat. She turned towards me. "Especially Rachel." Hearing her say my name in that context feels surreal. For years, I had replayed old conversations in my mind, wondering if I could have done something differently. Wondering if speaking up had been a mistake. Yet sitting there now, I realized something important. The problem had never been the questions themselves. The problem was that nobody wanted to hear the answers. One of the senior board members cleared his throat. "Charles always values independent thinking." Evelyn nodded slowly. "I know." The man looked towards me. He spoke highly of Rachel more than once. Several relatives looked surprised. Apparently, I was not the only person learning new information that day. The board members continued. He believed the company needed people who would challenge assumptions before problems became crises. A faint smile crossed my face. That sounded exactly like Charles. He had never been interested in surrounding himself with people who agreed with everything he said. He preferred honest conversations. Sometimes those conversations were uncomfortable, but they usually led somewhere useful. Michael leaned forward in his chair. "There is something I need to say." Everyone turned towards him. He took a deep breath. 3 years ago, I failed Rachel." The room immediately grew still again. I knew she was trying to help. I knew many of her concerns were reasonable. But instead of standing beside her, I chose the easier path. He looked down briefly before meeting my eyes. I convinced myself that avoiding conflict would solve things. His voice grew softer. It didn't. I didn't know what to say. Part of me appreciates the honesty. Another part wished the conversation had happened years earlier. Yet holding on to that thought no longer seemed useful. The past can explain where we were, but it cannot change it. The meeting continued for another hour. Discussions shift from old mistakes to possible solutions. Financial forecasts were reviewed. Operational changes were proposed. For the first time, people appeared willing to listen to one another. The difference was remarkable. Fear creates silence. Trust creates conversation. As the afternoon sunlight began to fade outside the windows, the executives gradually left the room. Board members gathered their papers and stepped into the hallway. Eventually only 3 people remain in the library. Evelyn, Michael, and me. The quiet felt almost peaceful. Evelyn looked toward the fireplace before speaking. There is one more thing you should know. Something in her tone made me pay attention immediately. She opened another folder and removed a single sheet of paper. Unlike the other documents, this one was handwritten. Charles left instructions for me personally, she said. I never showed anyone. My heart skipped slightly. She stared at the page for several moments before continuing. I think it is time. Then she carefully placed the handwritten note on the table between us. And as I looked at Charles Whitmore's familiar handwriting, I realized the most important truth of all might still be waiting to be revealed. For several seconds, none of us touched the handwritten note. The library had grown quiet as evening settled across the estate. The last traces of sunlight filtered through the tall windows, casting long shadows across the floor. Evelyn finally pushed the page toward me. You should read it, she said softly. I looked down at the familiar handwriting. Charles had always written in neat, deliberate script. Every word seemed carefully considered before it ever touched the paper. I began reading. The note was addressed directly to Evelyn. At first, it seemed personal rather than business-related. Charles wrote about marriage, responsibility, and the burden of leadership. He reminded her that success often creates the illusion that certainty and wisdom are the same thing. Then the tone shifted. Charles wrote that one day difficult decisions would test the family. He warned that fear would tempt people to look for someone to blame instead of looking for solutions. My heart began beating faster as I continued. Then I reached the paragraph that changed everything. Charles wrote that if conflict ever arose between Evelyn and me, he wanted her to stop and ask herself one question. Is Rachel creating problems, or is she revealing problems that already exist? I read the sentence twice. Then a third time. Across the table, Evelyn lowered her eyes. The room remained completely silent. Charles continued. He wrote that throughout his life he had learned an important lesson. The people who challenge us are not always our enemies. Sometimes they are the only people trying to protect us from mistakes we cannot see ourselves. My throat tightened. 3 years ago, those words would have meant everything. Yet hearing them now felt different. Time had transformed pain into perspective. The note went on. Charles explained that he trusted my judgment because I cared more about long-term consequences than short-term appearances. He admired my willingness to ask uncomfortable questions. Most importantly, he believed I genuinely wanted the family to succeed, even when doing so made me unpopular. When I finally reached the end, I sat quietly for several moments. The last sentence was simple. Charles wrote that if the family ever lost its way, they should not search for the loudest voice in the room. They should search for the most honest one. I carefully placed the note back on the table. Nobody spoke immediately. Evelyn stared at the fireplace. Michael looked as though he was trying to process years of regret all at once. Finally, Evelyn broke the silence. I read that note after Charles died. Her voice trembled slightly. And then I locked it away. The confession hung heavily between us. Why? Michael asked quietly. Evelyn closed her eyes. Because I was angry. Tears appeared for the first time that day. Not at Rachel. Not really. I was angry at losing your father. Angry at the responsibility. Angry at my own fear. But instead of admitting that, I convinced myself I was protecting everyone. She looked directly at me. And when Rachel challenged decisions I had already committed to, I saw her as an obstacle. The honesty in her voice made it impossible to doubt her sincerity. For years, I had imagined this conversation happening differently. I imagined arguments. Defensiveness. Excuses. Instead, what I saw was something much harder. Accountability. The kind that arrives only after a person finally stops running from the truth. Michael leaned back slowly. All this time, he said, we thought the story was about a disagreement. He shook his head. It was never about that. Evelyn nodded. No. It was about fear. Outside, darkness had fully settled over the estate. The room felt smaller now. More personal. Less like a boardroom and more like a family confronting its own history. Then Evelyn looked at me with an expression I had never seen before. Rachel, she said softly, there is one final decision that belongs entirely to you. And whatever you choose next will determine not only the future of this company, but the future of this family as well. For a long moment, I simply sat there looking at Evelyn and Michael. The room felt quieter than it had all day. The documents were still spread across the table. Charles's handwritten note rested beside them like a final piece of a puzzle that had taken years to complete. I thought about everything that had happened. The accusations. The silence. The day I walked away believing I had lost not only my marriage but also a family I genuinely cared about. 3 years earlier, I would have answered immediately. Back then, pain would have spoken for me. But the woman sitting in that library was not the same woman who had left. Life had changed me. The years after I left had not been easy. I started over in a small apartment. I worked long hours. I built a consulting business one client at a time. There were nights when I questioned every decision I had ever made. There were mornings when success felt very far away. Yet those years also gave me something I had never possessed before. Confidence that did not depend on anyone else's approval. I looked around the room. You asked what I want to do next, I said quietly. Evelyn nodded. Michael remained silent. The answer is simple. I took a slow breath. I want the company to succeed. Both of them looked surprised. I could understand why. Many people expected revenge when given an opportunity like this. They expected bitterness. They expected old scores to be settled. The truth was far less dramatic. Carrying resentment for 3 years had never improved my life. Letting go had. Charles built something valuable, I continued. Not just a business. A legacy. It deserves a chance to survive. Evelyn lowered her eyes. After everything that happened, you still want to help? I smiled gently. Helping the company is not the same thing as returning to the past. The distinction seemed important. Because it was. I had not come back to reclaim my old life. I had not come back to restore a marriage or erase history. Some chapters end for a reason. Wisdom means recognizing which doors should remain closed. Michael looked at me carefully. I could see questions in his expression, but neither of us needed to ask them. Too much time had passed. Too much growth had occurred. The future would not be built by pretending the past never happened. Evelyn folded her hands together. What would Charles say if he were here today? She asked softly. I glanced at the handwritten note. Then I smiled. I think he would tell us to stop looking backward and start fixing what is in front of us. For the first time all evening, a faint laugh escaped Evelyn. It sounded tired but genuine. That does sound like him. The tension that had filled the library all day finally began to disappear. Not because every problem had been solved. The company still faced challenges. Relationships still needed healing. Trust would take time to rebuild. But something important had changed. The truth was no longer hidden. Nobody needed to defend a false story anymore. Before leaving, I gathered the documents and organized them into a neat stack. Then I picked up Charles's note one final time. His last sentence stayed with me. Search for the most honest voice in the room. For years, I thought those words were about leadership. Now I understood they were really about character. As I stood to leave, Evelyn surprised me. She walked around the table and stopped beside my chair. Her eyes filled with tears she no longer tried to hide. "Rachel," she said quietly, "I am sorry." There were no excuses attached to the apology. No conditions. No explanations. Just honesty. And somehow that made it enough. I squeezed her hand gently. "I know." Outside, the evening air felt cool and peaceful. The fountain continued flowing exactly as it had 3 years earlier. The mansion stood behind me, unchanged in many ways and completely changed in others. As I walked toward my car, I realized something important. I had not returned to prove anyone wrong. I had not returned to win. I had returned because the truth deserved a voice. And in the end, that truth gave something back to all of us. Not a perfect ending. Something better. A chance to move forward with wisdom, dignity, and peace.